further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jeanette Harder. Thanks so much for joining us today. Jeanette Harder has worked in the area of child abuse and prevention for more than 20 years and has served as a foster parent, a home visitor to families at risk for child abuse, and a provider of services to women and children escaping domestic violence. Jeanette now works nationwide as a researcher and as a writer and speaker on child abuse prevention, especially in regards to Amish and Old Order Mennonites. She and Alan Hoover are also the co-authors of For the Sake of the Child, Love, Safety, and Abuse in Our Plain Communities, and is also the author of the book, Let the Children Come, Preparing Faith Communities to End Child Abuse and Neglect. She earned her master's and PhD in social work and is a professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jeanette.
Thank you, Natalie. That was great. Thanks for getting us started. It's good to see folks, those that I can see. It's good to see so many faces and so many people also joining by phone. I look forward to this conversation with you, and I do look forward especially to the last 30 minutes where I get to hear from you and get to hear about, you know, what are things that I haven't thought about yet, and where might I go next with this work. So I appreciate your joining in today. Before I begin with sharing my slides, I do have two poll questions that I would love for people to participate in. And I realize those that are on the phone will not be able to see the polls, but maybe you can unmute and speak your responses if you so choose. So I'm going to invite Andrea, if she would, to share those questions with us. It's just two questions. How familiar are you with Plain Anabaptists? And how familiar are you with foster care and adoption? Just kind of helps me to know who it is that I'm speaking to here today, who's in the room with me. Seeing responses coming in, that's awesome. 17 of 25 have participated. That's probably about everybody because the ones on the phone can't. So Andrea, if you want to go ahead and end the poll and share, is it shared already? Thank you. Boy, we're good at this Zoom thing, folks. We've done this now, right? So as I expected, all of you are at least somewhat familiar with Plain Anabaptist. So that's super great that I don't have to go through those basics. And I'm super excited that 10 of you are, those of you that participated in the poll, 10 are Plain Anabaptist. And I'm guessing that many of those by telephone probably are as well. So that's great to know about my audience. And then how familiar are you with foster care and adoption? We've got, of those who responded, 4 have participated. A lot of us are, most of us are somewhat familiar with foster care and adoption. Anybody on the phone want to chime in with any response to how familiar you are with Plain Anabaptists or how familiar you are with foster care and adoption? And what do you do? What's it, Andrea? Is it *6 to be able to unmute yourselves? Yeah. So make sure everybody has the opportunity to speak if they wish. Okay. All right, so we will stop sharing that. That's helpful for me to know who it is that I am looking at here. All right, let me share my screen. There we go. Andrea, are you just seeing my slide? Is that all that are you seeing it okay?
Yep, everything looks great.
Okay, it's different on my screen than I expected, but that's all right. So, okay, folks. So today I am talking about Plain Anabaptist provision of foster care and adoption to children. Okay, just hold on. This is not quite working like I had hoped. There we go. Okay. All right, so I am just deeply grateful for this opportunity to have spent so much time with Plain Communities. I spent most of my time so far in Pennsylvania, also a lot of time in New York, Ohio, and Missouri. And I also had the privilege of being able to spend most of my summer immersing myself in this work with Plain Communities. Now that the academic year has begun again, I miss having so much time to be able to focus on this work, but it's definitely continued because it has grabbed hold of me and it won't let go. So overwhelmingly, let me just share from the very beginning that I am seeing so many good things being done by Plain Communities in response to child abuse. They're providing incredible care for English children who have been deeply hurt by abuse, many of whom have special needs. So as we saw from the poll, I'm assuming that most of you have a basic understanding of Plain Communities or you are a member. And so, yeah, I can just be able to dive into the work here. Now I got to figure out how to move your faces so that I can move my, there we go, my slides. Okay. So thank you for the nod, Andrea. So yeah, my work, just introduction, my goal through this work with foster care and adoption is to hear the experiences of Plain Anabaptist families in providing foster care and adoption to children. And I want to use that information to inform social services and build bridges between Plain Communities and social services. So my research by choice is very strengths-based, that I'm trying to look for the things that are going well and to be able to build on those. I am working to be culturally responsive, which means that I'm spending lots of time in the community, asking a lot of questions, doing a lot of observing, doing a lot of member checks, and a lot of reading as well. And I realized that with any research, but especially this research, there's no way that I can do this or do this well, at least without building relationships. So that's really the most important tool here for data collection and to be able to move toward any change. But I'm gonna be really, really clear that my goal is not to change Plain Communities, because that's not gonna work. I'm an outsider, right, friends? I am Mennonite. I don't know if that came out in the introduction or not, I don't remember, but I am a member of Mennonite Church USA, but still I am not Plain Mennonite. And so my goal is to, as it says in the first statement, is to inform social services and to build bridges, not to necessarily bring change in Plain Communities. So a quick background on foster care and adoption for those of you that are a little less familiar with this work. So I'll go through this really quick. You can look at the slides hopefully later. But there are, in 2019, there were about 673,000 children in foster care. 120,000 of those were waiting for an adoption. Every year, about 250,000 children enter foster care. So that gives you a little glimpse into the magnitude and the importance of this work. Nearly half of these kids are being placed in non-relative foster family homes, which would be like the Plain Communities that they are providing to English kids. Numbers are increasing, unfortunately, and it's especially hard to find placements for the older children and children with significant medical challenges. As far as foster homes, surprisingly, there really isn't that much research yet on foster homes and on foster parents. So that's a huge gap in the literature, not just with Plain Communities, but in general. So there are about a little over 200,000 licensed foster homes in 2020, which is a decrease from previous years. We do have the vital few here, which means that 20% of the non-kin foster homes are providing care to 50% of the children in foster care. So those foster families typically are those where mothers are not working outside the home. They have lower educational levels, they have stable home lives, and they have positive views of parenting. So this is out of the literature. This is not about Plain Communities now necessarily. And also a large chunk of our foster families are also from Protestant churches. As far as the experiences from foster parents, again, something that I'm finding a huge gap in the literature. So about 25% of foster parents do discontinue each year. So that need to continue to recruit is important. With 40% of those are leaving due to feeling like they weren't being supported by their agency. There's some literature about foster parents and how they feel about the training that they have received. They acknowledge in the literature that they don't always recognize how challenging the role is to be a foster parent, and most would like more training on how to care for kids with trauma, kids with special needs, and how to relate to birth families. Another thing I see in the literature is that foster parents are motivated by their desire to help others in need, and they are really able to show empathy and cognitive flexibility in their caring for children, and they typically have a strong support system. So you'll see as I go on to share my results that this is very parallel to what I saw with Plain community families as well. So that's interesting. So I think it's important for me as a researcher to think about the things that I'm hearing and how is it that they are the same as the English community, and how is it that they are, there's some unique differences. So adoption is not new to Plain communities. It has been going on for a long time. Many families have been doing it. I think there's definitely an uptick in the number of Plain community families who are providing foster care. So that I don't have solid numbers on this. It's something that I'm seeking to see how is it that I can find those numbers. But the number of families participating in foster care are significantly increasing, and also the families that are participating in adoption are also increasing. So there's quite a few, not to our surprise, there's lots of resources within the Plain communities to support these families. So I'm hearing a lot about annual gatherings. There's at least 3 that happen each year, and these are attended between anywhere from 400 to 900 families at each of these. So wildly popular, very, very important for this work. They also have, I'm hearing about a lot of regional picnics. I'm hearing about some publications. The 2 biggest ones that I'm finding are the Adoption News and the Amish Adoption Advocate. Also hearing about some organizations like We Lands that are providing education as well as financial assistance to families who are, particularly those that are engaging in international adoption where the costs are higher. Also, some groups are, more of the more conservative, or some of the more progressive Plain community folks are participating in online groups and finding those to be useful to them as well. All right, so moving on then to my research methods. This work is definitely exploratory in that it hasn't been done before. I am following a grounded theory, social constructivist approach, being qualitative in my work. Just going there because there's just not a lot known yet. So I just have to get to go in, ask a lot of questions, figure out what these things mean for Plain communities, and be able to try to capture their experiences and to be able to hear their understandings as to what they're doing, why they're doing it, how it's important, how it's impacting them. So my inclusion criteria for this research are Plain communities. And so in other words, any family where the woman dresses plain, who have participated in domestic foster care. So lots of folks are doing international adoption, and that's great and that's important, but that is a little different experience. So I am focusing on those families that do domestic foster care. Most have partnered with their county for social services. Some are working with private agencies as well. Using snowball sampling just to be able to find this population. So I have been able to gain the relationship with a lot of these families, and then they send me on to others who send me on to others. And that's how my sample size has been able to grow. I've also received a lot of referrals from people who serve or know these families. So I've been doing semi-structured interviews and focus groups. We have a planned script, which I'll show you on the next slide. And so, but at the same time, I have to respond to the context and what's going on in the situation, because I acknowledge that I'm a guest in these people's homes and they are the experts in their lives. And so I need to keep that as central in my work. So I need to follow their interests and their energy. So for example, I think about one family that seemed to be a little bit more difficult to be able to engage. They didn't know me, they didn't trust me. When I walked in the door, they had a photo album open that they were wanting to talk with me about. So we just moved through that photo album as they told stories about their children and used that as a guide for our conversation instead of my scripted questions. I got to all my questions eventually. They actually backwards, but I got to them all, and that was absolutely fine. We've also had a lot of my interviews interrupted by things like thunderstorms and goats and lots of children running through. And so I also think about one interaction we had that I was at a Dairy Queen. That's where they chose to have the interview. And then the Dairy Queen closed, but they weren't done talking. So we stepped out on the patio and we were interrupted by trucks that were flying by until 11 p.m. because they just had so much they wanted to talk about. So lots of varied experiences in where it is that these interviews happened. They are, of course, they are qualitative. I'm all asking open-ended questions with follow-up prompts, doing it primarily through focus groups, meaning that I would gather as many of the couples as they were comfortable talking in front of others. So some of the groups were 2 couples, 3 couples. Quite a few of them turned out to be just 1 couple at a time because that's what they preferred, either because of their family or because of some of the things they wanted to share with me they didn't want to say in front of others. I, of course, had informed consent, letting them know what I was doing, why I was doing it, what I was going to do with it. Made sure that they understood that I would be audio recording all of the interviews, and that talked about confidentiality, and thankfully everybody agreed to allow me to do the audio recording, which then allowed me to move forward with the transcription. So I did the transcription through a professional service, and then I edited those through an assistant, and then I edited them yet again by me. So I'm pretty confident of the data that we have received because we've gone through it many, many times. So I have over 500 single-spaced pages of rich data, which I am now working to analyze. All right, real briefly, these are the questions that I asked. Why did you get started in foster care and adoption? What's the role of your community? What have been your experiences with initial training and the home study? What have been your experiences with providing care to children and interacting with social services? What have been your best and worst experiences? Things that you wish that social services knew? And then what do you tell others in your community if they ask you, like, I wonder if we should be doing foster care and adoption? So focus groups lasted, I say typically about 90 minutes. Some were shorter and some were longer than that. All right, this is the sample event that I ended up. We have closed data collection on this study as of July. So we did speak with 24 foster families in 16 different groups. I did some follow-up conversations with 4 of those families to check out, do some member checking. This is what I heard. Does this sound right? Many of them are old order Mennonite. You can see even those that were conservative Mennonite, many of them were old order Mennonite when they were doing the foster care or when they started. Also spoke with some Amish and Amish Mennonite families. You can see that these families lived in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and a few in Missouri. About half of them were car driving, and about half of them were horse and buggy. And on average, they'd been married about 25 years. And I did a rough estimation of the children that they'd cared for. About 2/3 of them had cared for children that were only white or Caucasian race, and about 1/3 of them had cared for children that were other races. So that's a glimpse into who it is that we talked with. So what I want to do at this point is to share a story with you. And I want you to understand that this isn't a true story. This is a story that is a compilation of all the 24 families that we spoke with. And so every sentence that I say in this story, it takes about 9 minutes to read, folks. So just hang on with me as I read this story. But I think it's the best way to convey the experiences of Plain Anabaptists in providing foster care and adoption. So as I share, I invite you to be thinking about what was Joe and Sarah's motivation to get involved with foster care. What are the systems that they are involved with? So things like, healthcare and social services and law enforcement, who are those systems that were involved? What support did they need and did they receive? And what aspects of Plain community culture were evident in the story? So at the end of this, I will open it up. I hope that this can launch our discussion. And then I just have one slide remaining that just talks about where it is that I'm headed next. So let me see if I can get my story up here. There we go. Andrea, I feel like I'm talking to a vacuum. Are we still hearing me and everything's going good? Thumbs up?
So we can still hear you. We cannot see the Word document.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to read it.
Oh, okay.
Terrific. Okay, so again, this story, basically every sentence in this story was represented by multiple people at the Plain communities that I spoke with. Joe and Sarah were concerned. They had married 5 years earlier. Joe was partnering with his brother and father in the shop, and Sarah was home caring for their 2 children, Ben and Beth. Sarah had a medical situation when Beth was born, and now it seemed that their fears were confirmed. While their friends had 3, 4, even 5 children already, their family had stopped growing. Sarah went out to the barn where Joe was finishing the chores. Ben and Beth were playing in a water puddle not far away. Joe, do you think we should look into doing foster care? Joe looked up at his wife. He was silent. He knew how she longed for their home to be full of children, but that's what he wanted too. A week later, he picked up the mail and saw a manila envelope with a return address of their county offices. They pored over the material together. They called Joe's sister, who had adopted 3 children after doing foster care. She said, "Go for it, but don't expect it to be easy." They imagined what their parents would tell them about inviting the government into their home and about the future of dark-skinned children they would bring into the community. Joe and Sarah started going to the trainings with other potential foster families. They were overjoyed to see a Mennonite family from a nearby community. They endured the home study, with Joe building a new locked cabinet for his firearms and erecting a fence around their wood-burning stove, even though any child would surely know not to touch a hot stove. The caseworker asked them more questions than they could ever imagine. And just when they thought her next question would be the size of their underwear and the brand of toilet paper they purchased, she delivered the good news. They were approved as a foster home in their county. They waited longer than expected for their first placement. When it came right down to it, the workers just couldn't picture placing a child in their home. What would they tell the birth families? Finally, late one afternoon, the caseworker called. "Would you come to the hospital tomorrow morning?" Joe and Sarah flew around the house, preparing for the arrival of a new baby. They asked their neighbors to care for Ben and Beth the next morning while they went to the hospital. Isaiah had been born to a 16-year-old girl. Just 4 pounds and unable to breathe or feed on his own, he'd spent the last month in the NICU. The hospital social worker had done her best, but Isaiah's mother was not prepared to care for a child. She had stopped visiting him. She had brought Isaiah a toy giraffe and disappeared into the foggy morning. Isaiah was now ready for discharge, and the caseworker was handing a car seat to Joe and Sarah. "We can't use that." Surprised, the caseworker explained that all babies must be transported in a car seat. And then it dawned on her. Joe and Sarah had come in a buggy. Joe patiently explained that the buggy was not a vehicle, and a car seat would not make little Isaiah any safer. Before they knew it, Sarah found herself in a van with Isaiah, while Joe drove home alone in their buggy. Isaiah was a fussy baby, unlike anything they'd ever experienced with Ben or Beth. He cried all night and all day. Joe and Sarah took turns rocking him each night, all night. During the day, Sarah struggled to care for their little household while also cradling Isaiah. The next few weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, caseworker visits, and caring for a fussy baby. Joe and Sarah were grateful when the caseworker's supervisor let them know that it would be okay to transport Isaiah in their buggy. Just as they were beginning to find a new balance in their home, the caseworker called again. Would they be able to take in 6-year-old Tabby? Realizing Tabby's age, Sarah asked about school. The caseworker explained that the bus would pick up Tabby at the end of their lane and she would go to the public school. The caseworker also explained that Tabby's mother had entered treatment and was working toward reunification. Sarah thought about Tabby and how she must feel alone and scared and said yes. Tabby was certainly more active than Ben and Beth, but she blended right into their household. At first, she wore clothes that Sarah bought for her with the money from the county. But before they knew it, Tabby was asking to wear clothes that looked like Sarah's and Beth's, especially to church, and then later at home as well. She just wanted to look like the other children. The county asked Sarah and Joe to take Tabby to visit her mother in treatment each week, which Sarah was glad to do. Sarah couldn't imagine how hard this must be for Tabby's mother. While the county reimbursed them for the driver, it was exhausting to pack everyone up and go to the treatment center. It usually consumed the whole day. She tried to coordinate these visits with Isaiah's appointments with a medical specialist, but that didn't often work out. He was getting in-home services too, which sometimes had to be changed to accommodate Tabby's visits to her mother. Joe and Sarah were grateful whenever their neighbors offered help in the form of food, childcare, or just companionship. Life was full, but it was good. Going to church became more challenging than ever, though. Isaiah was often fussy, and Tabby simply would not sit still. Joe and Sarah sighed to themselves when they saw other parents with their children. Tabby's aggressive behavior around other children was beginning to make Joe and Sarah avoid community gatherings. Then one Friday, the school called and said Tabby had touched another girl inappropriately in the restroom. Joe went to school and apologized for Tabby's actions. Apparently, the school made a report because the caseworker pulled into their lane the next day. She asked why Joe and Sarah hadn't called her right away. Joe explained that their phone was not working and they had not yet had the chance to go to their neighbors. Besides, Tabby was home safe with them over the weekend. The caseworker told Joe and Sarah that Tabby's mother was about to be released from treatment and that her supervisor had asked her to move Tabby to a respite home for a few days, and then she would likely be returned to her mother. Joe and Sarah gasped and pleaded for Tabby to stay with them. But no, the caseworker said that would not be possible. Joe and Sarah only had time to quickly pack Tabby's few things, and before they knew it, the caseworker was pulling a sobbing Tabby out of their arms. Their home seemed quiet that evening without Tabby's energy. The next morning, Sarah called the county to say they wanted to take a break from foster care for 6 months. Joe and Sarah signed up to do foster care through a private agency that was nearby. Their new caseworker called just a month later. Even as Sarah was forming the words to say, "No, it's too soon," the caseworker began describing the 3- and 5-year-old brothers who needed a place to stay. "Just for a few days," she said. "These boys have had so many placements, and we need a home where the mother is home full time so they don't have to go to daycare. You are the only home we have for these boys." After talking with Joe, they consented. The boys had been severely neglected. They had apparently spent all their time snacking in front of the TV in a darkened apartment and were quite overweight. A few days stretched into a week and then a month. The caseworker expressed her gratefulness to Joe and Sarah for continuing to care for the boys. Over time, the boys became comfortable playing outside with the other children. But then the 5-year-old began having significant anger outbursts, and sometimes the other children would cry in fear of him. Joe and Sarah knew he needed discipline in the form of a good spanking, but they also knew that wasn't allowed. Joe spent hours restraining the 5-year-old until he would finally calm down and could listen to reason. Joe was grateful for the training they had received about trauma and was grateful for the support of other foster parents, as other parents in their church community just couldn't relate. Except for setbacks after visiting their birth mother, Joe and Sarah were satisfied to see how the boys began to blend into their family. They wondered how long the boys would stay. Joe and Sarah were relieved that Isaiah's adoption had been finalized and hoped that he would do okay as an African-American child in their community. They looked forward to continuing to grow their family. When another couple in their church asked Joe and Sarah if they should also consider doing foster care, Joe and Sarah said, "Go for it, but don't expect it to be easy." Okay, I'm going to pause at that time here and just invite you to respond to that, either some initial responses, or we can also go through the questions one at a time. So let me first just open it up. Any initial responses to that story, which I think is very realistic. I've checked it out with a lot of families, and they've said yes, that is really what it's been like for us. Who's going to speak first?
I can just, I'm not playing the background. We did sort of have some connections to German Baptists who also did foster care, who are out of the same agency. But this story sounds very familiar, sounds, matches our experience. I particularly was like when the social worker said, that just a couple days, that was kind of we had that experience, with all respect to the social workers, always take it what they say with a grain of salt. And sometimes you will be lied to, but that's, in general, it's sort of like they don't really know what's going to go happen, and you have to be flexible.
Thank you. Emma.
Hi.
I
Oh, sorry. I'm doing
sorry.
less of a Christian. I'm Jewish, not even Christian, but I focus on, I'm a PhD in political science right now, and I focus on strict sects as part of my research. So I had two questions about the story. I didn't get a sense of the family's kind of long-term vision for the children. Was there a sense that they could remain in the community forever, or when they came of age, there would be a moment where they had to commit to a certain plain way of life? Second, when they were talking about, teaching the children discipline, there's definitely an awareness of, the state's permissiveness versus their own culture. And I was wondering, how does that play out with vaccinations, especially these days? Is there a sense of, okay, well, we have to do this for our foster child, but not for our child, or we treat all of our children the same way? So those are my two reactions.
Great, Emma, thank you. Yeah, I can answer those in brief, and then maybe others can chime in as well who have experiences here. As far as their long-term vision for these children or for engaging in foster care adoption, I think most of the families I talked with were very much in the moment and just trying to make sure and get meals on the table and diapers changed and caring for these children. Those that were further along in the process, that maybe these children had now grown to adults and had left the home, could be a little bit more reflective. I think just like any Plain community child, they have the choice of being able to stay in the faith or leaving it. But families did not speak of a lot of like their expectations of what these children would do in the future, other than they would glow in their love and attachment for the children, and sometimes their pleasure with how well the children are doing, is sometimes a lot of sadness around how the children are not doing well. So I think they really cared more for the children about as individuals. They did not share their hopes or dreams about them necessarily staying in the faith, although that's probably the assumption for them, but they did not speak of that. In regards to the vaccinations, I did half of the data collection, or a third of it before COVID and 2/3 of it after. I'm doing it this summer. We did not have any questions that were specifically about COVID or about vaccinations. And so I was curious to see if that would bubble up, if they would just voluntarily speak of it. And it's much to my surprise, it never even came up. So in regards to this study, it is not something that they spoke of. And I am curious, I share your curiosity with that, Emma. Anybody else can chime in response to those, or anywhere you wish to go?
I was just going to comment somewhat unrelatedly a bit, but about the narrative compilation strategy you use there to sort of bring the audience in. I mean, I felt like I was there talking with Joe and Sarah. So I thought that was really effective, and maybe you could talk a little bit about your decision to do that as a way to sort of help us understand the motivations, the systems, the support, and the
Yeah.
cultural aspects of the community. I thought it was really, really compelling.
I'm glad to hear that, Natalie, because I've been nervous about that, because I primarily wrote the story to be able to convey to I'm going to say non-research population, non-research group, to be able to understand it, because it's so nuanced and it's so cross-cultural from most English audiences. And so I thought by telling a story, they would be able to better understand than my trying to incorporate all of it. I also did it out of necessity because I haven't finished analyzing the data. I've been able to go through all of it once, and I've done my open coding, but I haven't done my subsequent coding yet. But the responses that I've gotten so far to the story is that it is very compelling and that is helpful for communicating. So I think I will continue to use it in these professional settings as well as in other settings. So I'm glad to hear that's resonating for you, because I wondered if, like I said, I did member checking with the story. I read it to quite a few families. And I always preface it to say, this isn't true about everybody. You know, like, this is obviously a horse and buggy family. It's going to be different for car driving. But even my car driving family said this still represents well our experiences. So the story will get richer as I continue to analyze the data and as I move toward professional manuscripts with this work. Okay, well, let's kind of go through the questions then. What did you hear about what was Joe and Sarah's motivation to get involved in foster care and adoption?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Please.
Sorry, I don't have the video up, my mistake. I believe they felt they had the extra energy to provide the care for these children in their home. May I ask? Why
Yeah.
not adjusting? Or is there time for that at the end?
Yeah. So I would say I need to look at the data again, but I think at least, I think 100% of the families, maybe one was different, but I think 100% of the families, their initial motivation was because of infertility. Either they hadn't been able to have any children, or they hadn't been able to have additional children. Like, they started having, but they weren't able to have as many as they'd hoped. And then very, very quickly, sometimes even in training, but always within that receiving that first child, they're like, whoa, I am needed, I have something to offer. And they fall in love, they get attached with the child, and that's the motivation for them to remain involved. Over and over, I heard from families about losing a child, as far as like the child would go back to a birth family, which, you know, many times that's the intent, and that can be a success for that child. But they talk about their loss very, very emotionally, actually, in the loss that they feel when the children go someplace else, regardless of the situation. And what they would recite to me is like, okay, I'm not going to get attached next time. I'm not going to get attached. And then they smile like, well, that's ridiculous. That doesn't work that way. We can't care for a child without getting attached. So those are some of the things that I heard around motivation. A lot of them, I sought out families that had bad experiences. Everywhere I went, like, tell me some families who have stopped doing foster care, because I'd like to hear more from those who started and then stopped doing it. And I want to hear more about what were their experiences, about why they stopped. And they didn't trust me with those stories yet. So maybe those are ones that I can keep seeking out. Those were harder for me to find, because I know those have to be out there too. Any responses to that? Okay. What systems did you hear involved with the families, and what was that experience like for them? So I think many of you that are on this call also come from a lot of different disciplines, and so you would be interacting with foster care and adoption from different perspectives. Typically in this group, we've got people that are involved in healthcare. And I must say that everything I heard from families about providing healthcare to their children was positive. They had great interactions with the medical doctors, with healthcare systems. I didn't hear anything negative there, so that sounds good. They're certainly involved. Some of them have had to become involved with law enforcement because when children have acted out or run away, and for the most part, through this study, and I'm also doing a parallel study for both of them, I'm hearing really good experiences in engaging with law enforcement. I'm hearing more of a mixed bag in their experiences with social services. What did you think about more specifically their engagements with caseworkers? Good, bad, confusing? What did you hear there?
In your sample story, you mentioned this was a private agency, correct?
They started county.
Oh, okay.
They were unhappy with what happened at county because that's when Tabby got removed unexpectedly. And then they went and joined a private.
That would be one thing I'd be curious about overall is private versus public systems with foster care and adoption.
Yeah, I'd like to look closer at that, Stephen, too. I would, yeah. I heard goods and bads on both ends from but I can look closer at that data to see it. But there was a lot of switching of agencies. So there was either like a lot of like switching to a different county, either because of their experiences or the experiences of other foster families, or the switching from county to private. I don't think I ever heard from private to county, but the switching from county to private was pretty, or sometimes just starting, a couple of them just started in private and stayed there. But I'm gonna have to look closer at the data to see more about their experiences there, because I'm remembering negative on both sides as well as positive on both sides.
Well, it strikes me that overall, this is heavy emotional work. And I wonder how much training or assistance or support there is in public and private systems for, there are several emotions there. A new child, letting go of a child, dealing with a child. That takes a lot of emotional care. That's not so easy.
No, yeah, my heart went out to every single family that I spoke with, and just I saw that in their eyes. Go ahead.
If I could also, I concur with Steve. It certainly was very emotional, a lot of care work. But I felt that the social services, social workers, most of whom I thought were quite good or could have been there, they were so overworked in our county that they would tend to go on a list. For example, they would come through and see like all the door locks that were required, and is the fence appropriate, and so all the things you could observe and check off on your list. And they concentrated on that and then left. Whereas observing our interaction with the foster kids, were we being nurturant and so forth, much less emphasis on that. And primarily a time constraint on their part, but that was frustrating because then you couldn't ask them. I mean, we stopped asking them questions of what should we do this, and turned to like friends that were social workers. Because they just couldn't do it. They just didn't have the experience with our particular foster kids.
Yeah, I would say that's very similar to what I heard and observed as well. And I think that's probably something that's grabbing at my heart and my mind the most, is how can we find support for these families? Where can they find it in ways so that they can continue this, as sometimes they would call it a ministry, but as they continue with this work in caring for these children. Yeah, that support is so badly needed. Especially, a key theme that is going to be coming out in my research is around trauma. And over and over and over, the families talked about their appreciation for the training that they received and understanding trauma and how that impacts kids and how that then causes children to act in certain ways. And so lots of learning there, and they also learned a lot about different special needs, especially mental health needs, as they would teach me, like, Jeanette, you know about attachment disorder, right? And then they go, tell me all about it, and they'd obviously engaged in training. They'd obviously done a lot of reading on oppositional defiance disorder, on attachment, and then also a lot of physical conditions, as well as these families were caring for kids with autism, saw a lot of cerebral palsy, saw a lot of failure to thrive, saw, a lot of physical and mental health conditions. And so the support they need, friends, is so high. And so they are getting it mostly from the other foster families in their communities. So I'm seeing a lot of clustering, that they gather together with others that are having similar experiences. We all do that, right? With people that are similar things to us. But I think where I saw some of the greatest need was when these children get a little bit older, especially after they've adopted them and they're still in these families. So the need for post-adoption services is huge. Some of these kids have disabilities that linger on into adolescence and young adult. And some of these foster parents that shared with me fear for their life in caring for these children. And I was actively trying to connect them with other services in their community to help them to be able to get the help they need to care for these traumatized kids. What's astonishing to me, I'd like to compare also again to the English experience with foster care, is I heard no stories about disrupted adoption. Whereas in the English world, adoptive families, unfortunately, a lot of these adoptions do disrupt. I don't see any of the ones that I experienced. I saw no Plain community families giving up on these kids. They will do whatever it takes to care for them, even if their life is threatened by the child.